This video will discuss strategies for multiplying by sevens. So when multiplying by sevens, we have to think about the number 7 and how can it be decomposed. Well, 7 is not an even number, so we can't split it nicely like we can with 8 or 6 or 4. So we have to look at how can 7 be broken up. We could do 1 and 6, 3 and 4, 5 and 2. So I think since 5s for most people are easiest, I think it would be smart to do 7s as 5 and 2. So in this case, we have 7 groups of 4, but instead I'm going to think of it as 5 times 4, and then what remains is 2 times 4. So I know 5 times 4 is 20, 2 times 4 is 8, and so when I add those parts together, I can get my final answer of 28. So symbolically, here's what that might look like. So 7 times 4, I'm going to think instead of 7 groups of 4, I'm going to think of it as 5 plus 2 groups of 4. So using that distributive property, I'm going to distribute that 4 and come up with 5 groups of 4, which was the top part of my array, and 2 groups of 4, which was the bottom part, which ends up to be 20 plus 8, and my final answer is 28. Now with 7s especially, you'll notice it was the last in the sequence. 7s was one of the last facts that you learned, and that's because many of the other strategies are a bit simpler than the 7 strategy. So for instance, in this case, you had another option here, maybe like your 4 strategy. 4s is having us look at 2 groups of doubles. So in this case, I might have instead leaned on my 4s and thought of this as 2 groups of 7 plus 2 groups of 7. 14 plus 14 is 28. So with all facts really, I would stop and think, what's the best strategy to use? Is it my 7s or is it the other factor? Here's another example of that thinking. 7 groups of 8. That's a lot to think about. So if I split this up and I lean on my 5s, I can think of 5 groups of 8, which is 40, 2 more groups of 8, which is 16. 40 plus 16 makes 56. So in multiplying by 7s, if ever you have an even number as the other factor, the 7 strategy works pretty nicely. It's when it's an odd, the other factor is odd, it gets a little trickier. So if it's 7 times 9, I personally would do the 9 strategy. If it's 7 times 3, I would use my 3s strategy. Same with 2s, with 5s. I would always stop and think which is the most efficient. So in our last example, I have 7 times 7. I have no choice but to use the 7 strategy. So again, I'm going to think of that as 5 groups of 7 plus 2 groups of 7. So 5 groups of 7 is 35. 2 groups of 7 is 14. And when I add 35 and 14, I can have my final answer of 49. So remember, when multiplying by 7s, as within all problems, I would stop and think which is the best strategy to use for this problem. If you decide it is your 7th strategy, think of a group of 5 and a group of 2.